So far, I've been playing this character since the start of the season, and I have to say, the gear, the playstyle, a lot's undergone changes. So today is going to be my video on the final version of his build, which isn't to say that it isn't possible to upgrade the character from here. It is just to say that I've achieved a level of damage and survivability that I'm perfectly happy with. I absolutely obliterate 8-4, and I don't really feel like there's anything else to push for. So instead of spending ever increasing amounts of money on something that really doesn't do very much for me, I'm going to go on and play a different build after this. Which one? I don't know, you'll have to get subscribed to find out. But first, let's talk a little bit about what I've done on the character. For example, I got to over wave 40 in Trial of Divinity. As it turns out, getting to wave 40 quite easy. After wave 40, the difficulty definitely picks up a good bit. But one thing which was way easier than I expected is beating Path of a Brave 45. Farmed that for like an hour, turns out is pretty darn easy. Also, didn't get anything too notable, so there won't be a farming video there. But I can definitely say that my build is very well suited for it. Then in terms of general 8-4 mapping, I've improved a lot about my build. Not only the coverage for my damage, but also my damage has gone up massively since the last video. At this point, I haven't really been doing very much dummy testing because I have to take off so many supports that I don't feel like I get an accurate picture of my build. Now in my build update video, I focused mostly on the changes from the starter version, but in this video, I'm kind of going to take it from the top, go over all of my items, all of my skills, and explain some of the logic for why I'm using them. This is because so much has changed that I feel like it's a completely new build. And so let's get into that, starting with the absolute most important change that I made, which is adding activation medium rhythm, and specifically a near perfect rolled one that triggers every 0.2 seconds. This is by far the biggest damage upgrade on the build. And it's not cheap. I paid around 6,000 Flame Elementium for mine, which at the time I bought it was probably about twice as much as I had paid for all the rest of my gear combined. And it also multiplied my DPS by 5 times immediately. This is a massive game changer. It does an absurd amount of damage. And I would say if you're looking for how do I go from this build feeling like 0 to this build feeling like hero, it is by getting activation medium rhythm. Your second question is, does it absolutely have to trigger every 0.2 seconds? Well, just think about it this way. If it triggers every 0.4 instead of every 0.2, it's adding half as much damage. Now for my other supports, I was just experimenting, but again, my damage is so high now that it's really hard to get an accurate measure. So I kept crit strike damage increase. I kept steamroll since even if the damage isn't necessarily 100% optimal, you absolutely want to use it for the skill area. And I added mark support. Being able to mark enemies means they take 40% increased critical strike damage, and they have minus 20% evasion, which doesn't actually affect this build. Plus it does extra damage against marked targets. And then for the last support, after trying a whole bunch of different stuff, I ended up going with high voltage. And this is because I was experimenting with what do I drop for a defensive skill? And for a long time, what I dropped was actually my curse. But then I realized the curse was outperforming the empower skill. So therefore, leaning into that shock, giving myself better shock chance, seems like a pretty good idea. And speaking of, electrocute is exactly why I went for lightning damage as opposed to any other damage type. I do still need to convert my damage because I'm still using a corroded warden's breastpin. Technically, just in terms of raw DPS, fire cold lightning doesn't really matter. It's really hard to do anything with cold synergy for your minions. So, while freezing stuff is nice, probably not required, and fire damage, again, a lot harder to scale as minions than shock stuff. Shock stuff, you just put on high voltage, and then you put on electrocute, and you get a nice little boost of extra DPS. Plus, I'm using the activation medium preparation to prepare it every 6 seconds. This doesn't necessarily have to be a 6-second 20%. You just want to make sure that the curse is up 100% of the time. So it could be prepared 6 seconds with increased duration instead, which I think I have on a number of my skills. Then for movement, still using blink. Because I don't have enough mana to actually use blink, I'm using cost conversion, just spend a little life. I have plenty of regen to do that. Quick mobility to lower the cooldown. And of course, magic dash, just because 2 charges feels really good, and hey, a little extra move speed certainly won't hurt anything. And then I have life source. Why? Because I got shamed for having compound source. So it's life source now. Activation medium life. Whenever I go below 92% health, the skill triggers. This is very much to taste. The reason I have it trigger so easily is to get the limber stretch move speed buff. And with residues, it never falls off. If you want this to actually be an emergency heal, though, you'd want this to trigger something much lower, like 60%, and instead of limber stretch, you'd want instant restoration. Also, instead of residues, you'd want something else. Probably something like either fragile or possibly emergency. And then last up, my defensive skill. This is another I've gone back and forth a lot between different things. For a while, I was using Frost Shield, and against physical damage alone, it was definitely the best option with minus 32% Fizz and Fire taken. But the Ice Watcher, Glacial Watcher, kept killing me. This doesn't help against that. So then I tried some other stuff, and I had rather mixed success. So ultimately, I'd recommend one of two things. The first is Delayed Pain for Injury Buffer. If you have good life regen on gear, this is a great option, because you'll be able to regen through the damage that gets staggered through Injury Buffer. On the other hand, if you don't have great life regen, which my current gear doesn't, because I didn't really feel the need for it, I recommend Defensive Buffer, which is minus 16% physical and elemental damage taken. And again, you're going to make sure you have enough cooldown recovery and duration to have this up 100% of the time. Would it be nice to trigger the 4 stacks of tenacity consumption? Yeah, absolutely, but this build doesn't have any really efficient ways to do that, and it's pretty darn good even without the extra minus damage taken. Then I'm using another Activation Medium Preparation, Uplifting for 32% increased defensive effect, Extended Duration to make sure it stays on, and then Iron Fortification for a little bit of extra armor. Honestly, you can use whatever you want in this slot, or just put something else here, like, let's just say, Auto Charge. Now for auras, this one's going to take a little bit of work, because depending on the mods on your slates, you may be able to run a slightly different configuration. So first up, Weapon Amplification. This is just a big old bunch of damage. Now, I would add Aura Amplification to everything. It's free and it gives you 12% Aura effect. If you can afford it, also add Restrain for the minus 10% sealed mana. If you can't afford it, just use Disciplined instead. It will reduce your aura effect and therefore reduce your damage, but you really want to be fitting in 4 full auras. And if you have a lot of restraints, then you can even put in Selfless here. But if you don't have enough restraints, probably not worth it. In terms of supports, you're pretty much going to copy this standard setup, except you won't be able to support most of them with Selfless. And in some cases, you wouldn't really want to. For example, Fearless gives additional melee skill crit strike rating and melee skill crit strike damage. Self-Destruct Protocol is a melee skill, so it gains the additional crit strike damage. And because this aura applies to you, and your crit strike damage via Warden's Breastpin applies to your minions, it kind of sort of double dips, which is why you don't want to put Selfishness here. Next up, Electric Conversion, another big old buff with some additional Lightning Pen. Again, a very similar setup. And last but certainly not least, the incredibly powerful Precise Elemental Resistance. This gives 4% max res. Normally, resistances cap at 60, but for every point you get over 60, if you have max res, you can further mitigate elemental damage. This is quite expensive. After the Activation Medium, for the Spider Tanks, this is the single most expensive skill that I'm using. And it's absolutely 100% worth the price, because this gives a massive amount of defenses, as you'll see shortly. Now, before I go on to Soul Candles, why summon Spider Tank specifically? Well, unfortunately, it's really hard to find a reliable chart for minion stats and how they scale as they level. But with a level 48 summon Spider Tank, this seems to be pretty decent, and back when I could actually measure my DPS by hitting the dummy, I tried Summon Grim Phantom, Summon Spider Tank, and Summon Machine Guard. And Summon Spider Tank was not only the cheapest level 21, but it slightly outperformed the other two once I dropped Mechanical Modification. The reason that I dropped Mechanical Modification is it didn't seem to be doing anything anymore, which I'm pretty sure is because my single hit is so high with all the damage bonuses that I'm capped at the 500 billion. And if I can't hit harder, I would rather hit faster, i.e. have 5 minions instead of just 3. The reason Spider Tank scales a little bit better is because summoned Spider Tanks gain 6% additional damage for every Spider Tank summoned by this skill. So essentially, it's a free 30% damage multiplier, since the Activation Medium is going to ensure that you have 5 Spider Tanks out at all times. This would explain why Summon Spider Tank outperformed both Summon Grim Phantom and Summon Machine Guard. Turns out, saving money at the time was absolutely a good choice, though I kind of suspect that over time the price of Summon Spider Tank is going to go up, and it may end up being the most expensive. Then next up, Soul Candles. Minion skill level, minion damage. That's the only reason this candle exists, and then a non-existent downside. If you can't get minion skill level, there's plenty of other things you can use, especially just damage resistances, or even something like this. The main skill is supported by level 20 Hardened. In this case, the main skill is Summon Spider Tank, and this should transfer over to the Self-Destruct Protocol, which again is a melee skill, despite Summon Spider Tank not being melee. I know, isn't this class super straightforward and wonderful? The reason I got this specific one is there's also the 12% curse effect. Since this is a relevant portion of my damage, curse effect is good. And the downside of minus 14% weapon attack speed, I'm going to guess that even though I'm technically giving my weapon to my minions, I'm not giving my weapon attack speed bonuses. Again, I haven't super scientifically tested this or anything. This is just my gut feeling. But my gut feeling is this here doesn't actually apply to the minions. So that's skills. Let's now take a look at talents. Starting with God of Machines. The actual nodes are largely what you saw before. Now the talent I went back and forth on is right here. It gives minion max life and command per second, which is a really good command generator, but right now my command just drains away because I don't really have command slates. A command setup would use new God slates to allow you to generate a massive amount of command consistently. The reason I didn't go with this is when I was first planning out my character, new God slates were expensive, very much out of my budget. Then after buying the other things, I was like, do I really need to min-max for my damage? I'd rather get additional defenses. And unfortunately, command slates are going to be pretty much mutually exclusive with defenses because a lot of them are the legendary new God things that have no life or anything like that on them. The other change here is going into isomorphic arms to give my minions my weapon. Realistically, if your weapon isn't very strong, Mighty Guard is pretty darn close, even with over 40 skill levels. Then in this tree, Boss, of course, for chance for synthetic troops to deal double damage. This gives me pretty darn close to a 100% chance for minions to deal double damage. And Kinetic Conversion. It's not as much damage as Burning Aggression, but damage isn't a problem. And this gives defenses like minus 20% damage taken and Barrier. Layering defenses is the #1 way to not die in Torchlight Infinite. From here, the goal was pretty much just to click all the minion nodes, with a couple exceptions here. Like this, because again, the command was just draining away, and the minion skill area was not ultimately that relevant. Also here, minion aura effect, while it's okay, isn't super critical, and the armor damage penetration not super critical, so I ended up grabbing a couple of extra points here from damage and putting them into defenses, things like extra life and life regen. Most of which was actually in Steel Vanguard, where I was able to fill out this entire life energy shield wheel. As a note, if you're using empower skills instead of curses, this would be better, but with the extra curse, it was worth dropping that. And also, technically, this does feel pretty good. However, I didn't ultimately feel like it was necessary, as my restoration skills were absolutely feeling amazing already. So I just went into stuff like Aura Effect instead. I did keep Reflection, 30% additional Aura Effects, really nice. And I did keep Knowledgeable. I thought about going for Poison Immunity or Panacea, but ultimately, even without too many Empower skills, Dark Gate is free from boots, and plus 10 defensive skill levels really do help out, so I felt like Knowledgeable was the best option here. For Statue of a New God, one thing changed. I got so much crit multi with my Warden's Breastpin, but I didn't feel like stacking any more crit multi was actually worth it, so I swapped over to Focus Strike. This is also mostly me being lazy and not buying a new weapon that has both the skill levels and the Focus Strike. And so I also swapped over to this, own one additional stack of Focus Blessing. This does work with Winter of Origin. And this to convert 100% of minion physical damage to lightning damage, since if you're not using Grim Phantoms and you are using a Corroded Warden's Breastpin, you need some way to convert 100% of your minion damage to any element. Then for the remaining, a defensive slate with damage transfer instead of double minion level. Here, remove all dot damage when using a restoration skill, really good for when you stand in poison puddles. And then minion skill level and converts fizz taken to a random element. The higher your resistance, the more effective this node's going to be. So it felt absolutely worth it. The reason I haven't done any of these to gamble legendary talents is mostly because it's really, really expensive, and I wasn't entirely sure how many good defensive legendary nodes stacked. Most of the best ones don't actually stack like this, and so while I could get more fizz taken conversion, it didn't feel like the best use of my resources. Though, if you're rich and you want to gamble, go ahead and try to get some extra defenses here, or maybe even extra damage such as through minion skill level. Alright, now hero traits and items. Starting with Quick Battle. This is overload cooldown recovery speed, and adds base fizz damage equal to 50% of a minion's max life and energy shield. This is why increasing minion life is in fact a damage boost on this build. And of course, preparation doesn't really change very much. Guerrilla Tactics. For each mechanical part collected, you get 8% additional damage, stacking up to 30 times. Spoiler alert, this is going to be pretty much stacked at 30 forever because you're triggering 5 extra times a second. And you get 3% skill area, stacking up to 30 times, which again, pretty much permanently stacked. This is awesome. Now here's the important one. If you have Dominion of the Iron Pack, you get Heroic Sacrifice. So this is given by Dominion of the Iron Pack, which is why Fuel War with War is spec'd. This is better. So, if you don't have Dominion of the Iron Pack for whatever reason, spec into this rather than this. But personally, I found that this outperformed any rare combination of hero memories. And also, getting this and using it for a massive damage boost lets me use some of my hero memories for utility, which personally I found to be better, because damage wasn't my issue, utility was. Which is why, for example, I'm using Aura Effect and Crit Strike Rating. Crit Strike Rating is, after all, just damage. Goes 14 to 18%, stacks up to 10 times, so 140 to 180%. And then up to 14% Aura Effect, which not only increases damage, but also increases defenses via elemental resistance or the Maximus from precise elemental resistance. Then Minion Max Life and adds player life to Minion Base Life, which yes, is then scaled by the Minion Max Life. That one is a damage memory. And here's my very nice utility memory. Adds % of a player's max life to base minion life. And then movement speed, because who doesn't want to move around faster? This is how I've built my hero items. Honestly, if you go with a double movement speed, you're probably not going to notice the difference. Or if you go with double damage because you really don't like the movement speed, that's probably fine too. And remember, while this isn't the most damage, this is still 100 flat base damage. So even things like Energy Shield aren't completely useless. Oh yeah, this is the one that I often swap into when I'm mapping. Crit strike damage for minions, and then 14% move speed. If you're wondering why am I using a T2 roll and something that's not optimal, because I found this, and I'm lazy, and I one-shot everything in 8-4 anyway. So it doesn't matter. What matters is move speed, but I've been doing City of Eterna recently, where move speed isn't all that helpful, so I swapped into something that adds a little bit more damage, but also probably doesn't matter, because I'm pretty sure I'm max hit capped. Now, in terms of pets, I've just been using loot pets. I already do so much damage that damage pets feel completely superfluous, so I haven't even been using them on bosses, instead opting for defensive stuff. But realistically, the answer is use whatever pets you have, as you shouldn't go out of your way to buy them, especially not for this build, where honestly you have plenty of damage, plenty of defenses, plenty of everything. Speaking of, let's take a look at the gearing, and also go over some of the crafting that I used to make it. So the reason that I was stacking so much Aura Effect is the more Aura Effect you get, if you're using precise elemental resistance, the more max resistance. In this case, plus 12. Also, I'm a little bit overcapped in part due to all the Aura Effect and in part due to all the attributes. So for legendary items, I'm still using Fiend Crown. Haven't found anything that outperforms it. At this point, my damage is high enough that I probably could just go with a really nice defensive rare, but as I went out of my way to craft this item a while back, I'm really happy with it, I enjoyed the process, and so I don't really plan to change it. For Warden's Breastpin, I did end up getting a better roll here. elevated minion skill level, so your minions cannot deal physical damage, and then 111% of crit strike, rating, and damage is applied to minions with aura effect and max life. Because this isn't a priceless item, sadly no T1 here. And for Winter of Origin, I got, I guess, lucky but also unlucky. Lucky in that I hit a corroded elevation, unlucky in that it's the worst possible one. What I'm probably going to do is try to hit the elevation here. This will give move speed, which in my opinion is much more valuable than either additional cooldown or additional stacks of focus blessing, because these things affect damage. And like I've said many times before so far, damage is already incredible. Quality of life, aka movement speed, is better. Now, this is a new item, the Void Embankment. The reason that this item is so good is because you get 150 of all stats with an elevation, 100 all stats without, and unlike the other chests that you might be familiar with, Royal Cycle, that gives you 100 all stats, Royal Cycle has a resistance penalty. This has a resistance bonus. So, a lot of my res cap is actually coming from the Royal Cycle plus the aura, to the point where resistances on gear are barely needed, and in fact, I'm at least 10% over cap on all elemental resistances from getting so much due to Void Embankment and elemental resistance aura. But of course, with that said, even being overcapped on res, Void Embankment with the 150 all stats is a great option just for the damage, and the elemental resistance aura for the max res is absolutely crucial to your late game defenses. And then last up, the Mind Infusion, which I got very lucky on. I'm just going to say, you should not try to recreate this item. This item was me sniping a 4 legendary aptitude with deflection, movement speed, and T0 max life. This mod is incredibly rare. If you're trying to create this for yourself, you'd really want this on the base item rather than this. This is the easiest thing to get, but this is just someone else's item that I purchased, and then I double corroded it, and I hit the double elevation, which is, out of the 8 attempts I've tried this season, the only one that hit the double. So, you know, about average RNG. And by the way, it's about 450 Flame Elementium per attempt. So yeah, very expensive, don't double corrupt, just single corrupt, but any single corruption is pretty darn useful here. And so now let's take a short break to talk about how to craft one of these legendary items. So the first thing to do is either drop a suitable base or search for it on the trade house. Now, under ideal circumstances, you do not want to use the prototype crafting at all on legendary items. You want to use all the plasticity to upgrade the modifiers. Sometimes you can click a couple times to do this. But if you're upgrading 2 modifiers on the item, which is pretty frequent, even just from T2 to T1, doing so uses a minimum of 150 plasticity, or a max of 250. So on the first click, it can just straight use all the plasticity. And since it's a minimum of 150, if you even click 4 times in the prototype phase, well, then you have to get exceedingly lucky to have any chance at upgrading 2 T2 affixes. And instead of 2 T2 affixes, you're probably going to have like a T4 and a T5. So the only time that I would use any plasticity at all for that is if you only need 1 affix because you plan to take it to tier 0. When you take it to tier 0, either the Ultimate Ember succeeds, in which case it takes off the other affix, so upgrading it doesn't matter, or it fails, removing 1 legendary aptitude, in which case the item is pretty much a brick, you sell it, and you move on to something else. Ideally, the affix that you want on your item is the one that's hardest to get naturally, so things like deflection or aura effect. Then from there, you just use targeted processing to add any other affixes that you want on the item. Keep going until you hit acceptable tiers, and after that, it's all about corrosion. Of course, you can corrode the base item, but in case you don't hit what you want, you can also corrode other items, then merge them using aptitude transfer. This costs a material dropped by the Clockwork Ballet. At the moment, it's pretty darn cheap on trade because it was made tradable shortly after the start of the season. This way, if you have something with perfect legendary affixes that you then elevate via corrosion, and something with perfect crafted affixes, you can merge the 2 items. But for more on that, check out my legendary crafting guide. Next up, let's talk about rare items. And a quick disclaimer, my rare items are not perfect, nor do they really need to be. This is just what I used that I said, hey, this is good enough. And okay, my gloves may be a little better than good enough. The stats that I personally felt were absolutely crucial were max life, +2 spell skill level, and any T0 attribute. So I really focused in here on getting the prefixes as good as possible. Then for the suffixes, generic res, crit damage, crit chance, maybe even fill in with an enchantment, because let's be honest, it didn't really matter after that point. Now when I first crafted these, I was still using the Royal Cycle, and I felt pretty darn res starved. So that's why elevating the fire resistance via a Dreamcraft worked out. That said, at this point, what I'm probably going to do is redo the Dreamcraft and elevate the crit strike damage, which will probably do nothing because I have too much damage. But hey, it'll make me feel better, and I certainly don't need the fire res. Then for rings, I pretty much just tried to buy things that had good suffixes off of trade and fix the prefixes later. That's exactly how I got this. It came with both the T0, Ellie and Erosion Hybrid, and the T0 Lightning Res. Alright, then for rings. This ring is one that I picked up relatively cheap off of trade. Except instead of the T1 Erosion, T1 Cold, and T1 Armor, these were all like T3 and T2 affixes. And so what happened there is I kept upgrading and upgrading, ended up getting pretty darn lucky, got them all to T1. A lot of my best items this season, I've actually not crafted. I've bought and then upgraded. Same thing here. I bought this. This was like T4, T3. This was T0. This was exactly as is. Then I upgraded, and I upgraded, and I upgraded, and then I put on T0 here and hope to hit any reasonable dexterity, which it ended up getting with T4. Can you craft a better weapon? Yes, and I will talk about that in just a second, but is this absolutely good enough? Also, yes. Now, if you looked closely during some of the gameplay footage, you might have noticed that in some of the footage, I am not using the big old bonk weapon. I'm using something a little different, and that is Oversight. Now, I think Oversight is actually slightly less damage than the main weapon that I've talked about, but because this build has more than enough damage anyway, Oversight offers some very interesting quality of life effects. Specifically, that every 2 seconds, you gain the following effects in turn, plus 100% skill area and plus 80% movement speed. So, you get 160% movement speed when wielding 2 of them every 2 seconds. This is really nice while mapping and absolutely accelerates your clear speed. So long as you have enough damage to cleanly do 8-4 without running into any issues, you should definitely be using Oversight for the quality of life alone. And any good stats that you can roll on it, all the better. But if you can't roll good stats, then don't worry about it too much. And much like with a two-handed weapon, you want stats like all skill level, minion skill level, spell skill level, minions have a chance to deal double damage, minion damage, attributes, all that fun stuff. But again, so long as you're smoothly clearing maps, don't overinvest on these as they are a swap weapon, and for anything more serious like bosses, I absolutely recommend swapping to a two-handed hammer. Now this ring is another legacy gear piece from when I was wearing the Royal Cycle and I needed more resistances. Again, if I was redoing this today, I would have elevated the crit strike damage instead of a lightning res, but it provides a significant amount of resistances. Then I crafted on the max life and dexterity. Since I hit T1, T1, I basically went, all right, every time I hit T1 or higher life, I will try to hit dex, and if I hit T1 or higher, I'll keep it, otherwise I'll keep going. That's what happened, and that's what I did. Now in terms of some alternate gearing options. For gloves, really the only thing I would change here is an actual erosion res roll, or critical strike chance instead of damage if you need it. On the rings, there's quite a lot of options. If you're super over res cap, like I am currently, then instead of the all res and erosion res, maybe go for just erosion res. If you need crit chance, go for crit chance instead of crit damage. That's actually what I did on this ring when my gear was worse. If you want more life, instead of just flat max life, you can also get percent life and defenses. If you want damage, dex and strength, those are all really good damage stats. Minion damage, really okay damage stat. And you can also even get command, which would work if you had a command slate setup. But I think the question that most people are going to wonder isn't how to craft a ring, it's how to craft a weapon. So let's go into that here just a little bit. First, go to the trade house, look for a two-handed mace, where you get either minion skill level, or alternatively, active skill level. Make sure it's tier 0, so +5 to +6, either one works. From there, buy like 4,000 or 5,000 flame sand, and begin in prototype crafting, spamming the item until you hit other useful mods. If the mods are good enough, such as if you have focused strike or minion double damage, then realistically you only need one other good mod. But if it's just things like minion damage, attributes, minion crit strike chance, minion crit strike damage, any of those things that do apply to both your minion and then your minion again when they're wielding the weapon of isomorphic arms, I would recommend spamming until you get all good mods. So 3 extras beyond the base. Because it costs quite a bit of flame sand to spam this, it's going to take you a while. But once you hit something that you settle on, upgrade everything as high as you can, ideally all to tier 1. Depending on the starting tiers, this may and may not be possible. From there, you have 2 choices. The easy mode is just finish the weapon using targeted processing. This is exactly what I did, except I skipped the prototype phase because I bought my weapon with the affixes that I wanted and upgraded them to tier 1. Or the risky one, especially if it has a dead mod that you want to get rid of. Well, the risky way to do it is then to upgrade something else to T0 with an ultimate ember, which will remove a random mod. It can remove things like the T0 minion skill level, which will completely brick your item, set you back however much you spent so far. Alright, so I know that was a lot. In fact, I think this is my most detailed Torchlight Infinite build guide ever. So if you want to see more videos like this, then number 1, do be sure to give it a like. Number 2, tell me down in the comments that you like these longer, more detailed videos. And number 3, be sure to share it with all your friends. But also, if you want a quick refresher on any of the choices I made, or to see my gear in action, then you can either A, head over to my Discord where I'll have a build link, or B, head over to MaxwellGG and check out the builder, where I'll also have a build link that updates to all my current gear. Now, if I make super significant changes, I'll upload that as a new build. I don't know, if this one's the min-max version, that might be the hyper you have way too much money version. But if I make small tweaks, such as actually fixing my res, for example, then I'm going to make sure that shows up on the Maxwell version as well. And so for now, I want to just end things off with a few gameplay-focused observations. Starting with number 1. I surprisingly didn't miss mechanical modification as much as I should. I think this is because my build ended up doing so much single hit damage that there wasn't really a DPS loss here. But going from 3 spider tanks that are able to independently target things around the screen at once, to 5 spider tanks that are able to independently target things around the screen at once, actually noticeably improved the clear speed and thus increased the speed at which the build moved. Because some of the time I wasn't actually moving slowly because I was literally walking slowly. I was moving slowly because I hadn't actually killed everything on screen and needed to wait for my spider tanks to respawn and hit stuff again. Also, getting the activation medium was night and day, to the point where I would say if you have 6k FE burning a hole in your pocket, or whatever the price that it is, because for all I know it's going to be 30k FE by the time you're seeing this video, or maybe it's down to 2k FE. Either way, if you can afford it, go buy it right now. It is the single biggest difference in your DPS, which also makes sense because if you can't hit things harder, if your damage upgrades don't actually matter in terms of hitting things harder, then all you can do is hit things faster. And here's where the big caveat / disclaimer comes in. I'm not exactly sure how much minion crit chance, minion crit damage, chance to deal double damage, strength dex int, or increased minion damage is ideal. Because the better my gear got, the harder and harder and harder it became to test. I'd have to take out 1 support, then 2 supports, then all the supports, then my activation medium. But then without my activation medium, am I actually triggering my skill in a way that's normal? Or am I triggering it so slowly that I'm not stacking all the buffs that I'd normally have in combat, thus missing other important things? And so ultimately, I decided that focusing on and min-maxing for DPS didn't matter. And from that point, I focused on defenses. This is when I got the precise elemental resistance aura. This is when I started stacking even more aura effect to get that max res as high as possible. This is also when I started to really focus in on stacking max life and getting secondary defensive modifiers on my slates, plus picking up armor where I could. And this absolutely made a difference, because before, occasionally I was dying. I wouldn't say it was super common, but it definitely happened from time to time. And after, I absolutely stopped dying. Because as it turns out, if you increase your defenses, you die way less. Though unfortunately, the Glacial Watcher does occasionally still manage to kill me. So for me personally, I would call this Commander Moto charge calling absolutely min-maxed. I don't think I'm going to be improving my gear further. Instead, I'm going to be trying to recoup some cost by selling off all the random items that I bought and crafted to test different permutations. And then I'm going to put all that money into a new build. Maybe the new shiny Carino Ring of Blades, or maybe something else entirely. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I'm glad you enjoyed the video. If there's any other specific builds you'd like to see, do let me know down below, though no guarantee that I'm actually going to play it. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe you say, hey, but I don't have that much FE and I'd like to start this build, then check out my season start version of a build, which is much cheaper, as it can be done with basic slates that are easy to purchase and literal floor trash that's very easy to find. But also, if you do want to see more really in-depth build guides like this, the best way to ensure it's possible is by becoming a patron or channel member. For as low as $1 a month, your direct financial support frees me from the YouTube algorithm and helps me to make what I want, which does actually happen to be these really long, detailed, in-depth videos. And so a link to support is down below. Of course, also a big thanks to everyone who watched to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.